I also want to address today's vote to override President Obama's veto of the bipartisan Hoeven-Manchin bill to authorize the Keystone XL pipeline. Our economy and North America's energy security would greatly benefit from building this pipeline. It would increase our GDP by approximately $3.4 billion annually. And the State Department, which has provided clear-headed analysis of the benefits of this project, has found that Keystone would support roughly 42,000 jobs during the construction phase alone. It would provide refineries with up to 830,000 barrels a day of North American oil. Moreover, the Keystone XL pipeline would be an environmentally sound way to transport this oil. The State Department's extensive environmental impact statement concluded that building the pipeline would actually be better for the environment than not building it. Now, we have to be clear here. This oil is going to go to market no matter what. Building Keystone would take oil off of the tracks and off of the roads, transporting in a way that is safer, more efficient, more environmentally sound, and better for creating good-paying American jobs. In his veto message, President Obama suggested that an issue such as this is somehow too important to be left to the legislative process, and that we should trust in the integrity of the regulatory process. Mr. President, this is exactly the sort of debate that we should be having in the Senate. This is the body that is supposed to debate the important issues of the day. And when a project as important as this is stalled without meaningful justification for so long, our involvement is even more important. In our consideration of this bill, we legislated according to the best traditions of this body, including robust debate, an open amendment process, and regular order. After years of mismanagement, our consideration of this bill showed how the Senate is back at work on behalf of the American people under our new leadership. And while I certainly hope that we will find another means of approving the Keystone XL pipeline, I am naturally disappointed that we came just a few votes short of overriding the President's veto and enacting this bill into law. Furthermore, I can certainly understand why many Americans will view this occasion as yet another example of how Washington is broken. In many respects, I share this same frustration. Nevertheless, we cannot allow ourselves to slouch toward pessimism and disillusionment about every institution. Indeed, I think my fellow colleagues on both sides of the aisle merit praise for their responsible handling of this bill. Instead, we should shine a light on where exactly the problem is and offer real solutions to make Washington work on behalf of American people. At the end of the day, the Keystone Pipeline and so many other bureaucratic failures demonstrate that our regulatory bureaucracy is broken. After all, this project is now in its 6th year of limbo, waiting for a single permit to be issued. This debate has gone on longer than the entire term of a United States Senator. It should not take years and years of navigating the federal bureaucracy only to have the government decide not to make a decision. This new Congress is focused on helping to create jobs and getting our economy back on the right track, which is why regulatory reform must be a key part of our agenda over the next 2 years. We must strive not only to approve this particularly important project, but also to prevent similar abuses from occurring in the future. Perhaps the two most troublesome features of the modern administrative state are, first, the size of the regulatory burden on the economy, and second, the lack of accountability. The lack of accountability in the regulatory bureaucracy. Both problems have been illustrated by the Keystone XL project, but they manifest themselves across the board throughout the regulatory process. The growing federal regulatory burden has been a concern for decades, but the problem is now worse than ever. Both the number of regulations and their combined cost have exploded in recent years. The American people are now bound by more than 1 million individual restrictions in the Federal Register, with a total cost of around $1.86 trillion, that's with a T, trillion each year. To put that in perspective, that's about 11% of our total GDP. It amounts to about $15,000 per household, and it totals over $300 billion more than annual individual and corporate taxes combined. In short, our regulatory burden is enormous. Even as we resist President Obama's mad dash to add new rules, our nation simply cannot afford to ignore the crushing burden of existing regulations. They weigh down our efforts to boost economic growth and make it impossible to get our country back on track. Every president, from Jimmy Carter to Barack Obama, has embraced the notion that outdated, unsuccessful, or otherwise ineffective regulations should be repealed. Nevertheless, the cumulative regulatory burden has continued to expand year after year. To address this growing problem, I will be partnering with Congressman Jason Smith to sponsor the Senate version of the Scrub Act, searching for and cutting regulations that are unnecessarily burdensome. This legislation creates a bipartisan commission to examine the entire administrative corpus in search of regulations that are obsolete, outdated, ineffective, overlapping, duplicative, or unjustified. Its goal is to achieve a 15% cost reduction in our nation's total regulatory burden. The Commission can either recommend either immediate repeal or incremental reform through a flexible procedure that puts the agencies and stakeholders in the driver's seat. The Scrub Act transforms a long-standing bipartisan commitment to retrospective regulatory review from mere rhetoric into meaningful reality. It would result in lower prices, higher wages, and more job opportunities for hardworking Americans. All the while, such common sense regulatory review poses no risk to our health, our safety, or our environment. It's the kind of legislation that can earn support from both sides of the aisle, and for which there is a realistic path to having it enacted into the law. Mr. President, a second critical flaw in the current administrative state is a fundamental lack of accountability in how the federal government makes and enforces regulations. Far too often, the agencies and interest groups manipulate the rules and stack the deck against innovators, entrepreneurs, and ordinary citizens. Thankfully, there are a number of potential avenues for meaningful reform, but one area that has thus far escaped much legislative attention is the role that the federal judiciary plays in the regulatory process. Given the broad authorities Congress has ceded to administrative agencies, the courts often stand as the only true independent check on increasingly out-of-control regulators. But recent abuses by the political branches have created serious challenges for effective and appropriate judicial review of the regulatory process. By writing vague laws, Congress has created extraordinary flexible grants of authority that are both unwise and constitutionally troublesome. Judicial deference to agency interpretations of the law has magnified this power to an extreme degree. Although originally intended as a means of curtailing judicial activism, Chevron deference and its associated doctrines have resulted in a gross misallocation of lawmaking authority. Such doctrines have consigned courts to a rubber stamp status rather than effective checks on administrative overreach. The threat of toothless judicial oversight of increasingly problematic regulatory action was only heightened when President Obama and his allies packed the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals with compliant judges even less inclined to engage in meaningful administrative review. And Congress's creation of broadly available private rights of action to challenge administrative decisions and regulatory activities has opened another avenue for abuse of the courts. While these provisions provide important opportunities for regulated parties to defend their liberties, too often they have allowed groups with no concrete stake in the process to use the courts as a means to drive their own ideological agendas. Worse yet, Inconsistent efforts by the judiciary to define the constitutional limits on standing have inadvertently created a perverse environment where businesses with real skin in the game are often shut out of court, while special interest groups with no meaningful injury in fact are allowed to litigate. Restoring the constitutionally proper judicial role is vital to returning accountability to the regulatory process. In reviewing agency actions, courts should hear only real cases and controversies. Where litigants have concrete interests at stake, that's what should happen. But when they do rule, they should state firmly what the law is and not simply ratify what the regulatory agencies argue that the law should be. Legislation to ensure meaningful reform on these fronts and to thereby bring the administrative state more in line with the Constitution will be one of my top priorities in this Congress. Mr. President, it is disappointing that we could not override the President's veto of this important legislation. The failure to authorize Keystone demonstrates just how broken our regulatory process really is. I hope we can use this occasion of bipartisan consensus to move forward in ways that fix our out-of-control bureaucracy and get Washington back to work for the American people. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor, and, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will